In 1645, here in Faversham in Kent in the UK, something awful happened. A chap called Thomas Gardiner fell out of a window. Did he die? No. The main real thing he did was hurt his bum. So, actually not that bad. That wasn't really the awful thing, because Thomas Gardiner falling out of a window led to the deaths of 4 women. And in today's video, we're going to find out how one guy falling out of a window and landing on his arse ended with 4 innocent women hanging from the gallows. This is the Faversham witch trials of 1645. So we should probably start off, as always, by providing a little bit of context about what was going on in England and Faversham in 1645. At this point, we're about 4 years into the First English Civil War. It was a time of incredible insecurity, religious tension, and a deep-seated anxiety throughout the country. And to add on to all of this, during the same period, the witch hunts that had been going on for a long time already were continuing to spread through East Anglia. It was in 1563 that conjuration and witchcraft became a statutory offence, not ending until 1735, when the Witchcraft Act was finally repealed. The witch hunts, which were led by Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, and had generally created a pretty widespread panic about witches in England, spilled into Kent in 1645, and historians have specifically pointed out these Faversham prosecutions as part of this specific spillover into Kent. And if you haven't seen my Pennenden Heath video and don't know anything about the insane number of executions that took place there, then go and check that out as well, because there was a very significant witch trial that took place there as well. Now, the general running theme with accusations of witchcraft tended to grow out of a few specific things, and it was the same in Kent. If someone was likely to be called a witch, it was probably going to be by somebody who had an issue with them. And throughout history, we've seen time and time again that these come about through neighbourly conflict, general quarrels, people cursing one another, just general bad feelings about people. And a general feeling that was kind of also fueled by this witch fear at the time, that if something bad happened to you, somebody must be at fault. So, something bad happens to you, you don't like your neighbour. There's a very, very simple but awful way to at once satisfy your sense of a need for justice and also remove something that you see as a problem. And during this whole era of witch hunts, it turns out a lot of those problems were apparently caused by otherwise seemingly innocent women. And men, we can't forget that some men were also caught up in this storm of witchcraft accusation, but of course it was mainly women. It's easy to forget just how much faith and religion guided people's lives back in the day. It still does for some, but it was obviously a lot more prevalent back then. And when you're living in what at the time would have been a much smaller town, a lot of the houses that were here are still, and religion would have been at the centre of everything, just as the church is here behind me. And so for people who had been wronged or fallen foul of just bad luck or an accident or just some kind of misfortune, it's very easy to lay the blame at the hands of the devil. But obviously the devil is not some guy who lives next door who you can just burden with all the responsibility. So you find the next best thing. And unfortunately, that tended to fall on people that either weren't much loved or lived outside of the regular society. And it's incredibly unfortunate that where there was rationality in other places, here the fact that these things could have been caused by the devil and the devil taking hold of these real innocent women, it just was something that just was not questioned. So they didn't really stand a chance. Those in Kent who were accused of being witches were frequently described as being ill-tempered or vindictive, or generally coming across as socially difficult. And hey, who are the easiest people to accuse of something with very little evidence? Probably people who live outside of society. And throughout many, if not all, of the county's cases of witchcraft, in inverted commas, you can't see me doing inverted commas, but I'm doing the thing with my hands, reasons of revenge and malice appear repeatedly. And that particular style, pattern of accusation fits this Faversham case almost perfectly. So you take Faversham at the time, a prosperous market town, a port community, so very important for the general working of the county. And also, of course, a working town, so a town in which something like a sudden illness or a sunk boat or a bad fall, which could put somebody out of work, these are the kind of unfortunate accidents that people didn't want to just take lying down, and so needed an outlet for their fear, anxiety, and anger. And so something as simple as a bad fall, like we're about to see, was not necessarily being put down to bad luck anymore, but became supernatural attacks. The 4 women who are named in the only surviving record we have of this case are Joane Williford, Joan Cariden, Jane Hott, and Elizabeth Harris. That sole account we have is a pamphlet that was written in the aftermath, very concisely called, as always, The Examination, Confession, Trial and Execution of Joane Williford, Joan Cariden and Jane Hott, who were executed at Faversham in Kent for being witches on Monday the 29th of September 1645, being a true copy of their evil lives and wicked deeds, taken by the Mayor of Faversham and jurors for the said inquest, with the examination and confession of Elizabeth Harris not yet executed, all attested under the hand of Robert Greenstreet, Mayor of Faversham. I messed up Faversham at the end of that, but yeah, I think you can let me off on that one. This pamphlet, as most pamphlets covering witch trials at the time did, tried to turn each of these women into a stock villain of witch literature. So as we've seen in the Pennenden Heath video and in many other cases, it presents them as being evil, misguided women making pacts with the devil to ultimately seek revenge on their neighbours. So how did these 4 unfortunate women end up in the worst of situations? Well, that's where this gets weird. And if it wasn't truly awful, could be straight out of a slapstick comedy. Sorry to interrupt the video. Remember, if you're enjoying it, remember to like, subscribe, be part of this growing community here. And if you really like it, you can always become a member, which gets you ad-free videos. It means you're helping me to carry on making these videos, which is great. Back to the video. The case begins with a man named Thomas Gardler, or Gardner as he's been called in various other retellings. Now, supposedly, at some point in 1645, Thomas Gardler was minding his own business, wandering around his home, when he fell backside first out of a window, in the process causing quite a bit of discomfort to his rear end. Now, the picture that is painted of this unfortunate accident that will very, very quickly turn more sinister is of this chap falling out of a window and being surrounded by women pointing and laughing at him. Although we have no evidence at all that any of the accused women were anywhere near this when it happened. But regardless, it seems that Mr. Gardler was particularly embarrassed by this, let's call it an unfortunate defenestration, and he immediately blamed a local woman called Joane Williford. And it wasn't long before Joan and the other 3 women mentioned in the pamphlet were rounded up and questioned. And when I say questioned, I mean questioned and tortured. While we're on the subject, it is probably worthwhile just going over a few of the details about how accused witches were interrogated. So let's hit the most common interrogation techniques. Number 1, sleep deprivation, or watching, where suspects were kept awake for days at a time, which, of course, as we all know, unfortunately, weakens somebody's mental state, which would often lead to confessions or confessions that came about through delirium. Number 2, searching for witch marks. Suspects were stripped and searched for any blemishes on their skin, skin tags, moles, anything like that. And what they were searching for was a witch's teat, which is something that they thought were used for feeding those familiars, those small dogs and little soft hedgehogs, or the devil himself. And so anything that could even vaguely be called a teat, which obviously, included rashes or moles, was said to be a witch's mark. And number 3, the swimming test. We all know this. In 1645, where I'm standing now would have been not too far away from where our 4 women unfortunately had to undergo this swimming test. Because this behind me here is Faversham Creek. And this is where they were If it was done the traditional way, their right thumb was tied to their left toe. Not necessarily a swimming technique I was taught when I was doing swimming lessons when I was a kid. And they were dunked into the creek here. If they sank to the bottom and, in a lot of cases I'm sure drowned, they were innocent. Great, fantastic. Their innocence would buy them a lovely plot in the cemetery. If they floated, they were guilty. And we all know where they were heading if that happened. They'd have to have picked the right time of day though, because if they did it now, they'd end up with one very muddy, upset witch.
And then on top of all this, these victims, let's call them what they were, victims, were forced to confess a pact to the devil and identify anyone else who was supposedly doing the same thing. And generally that was violent persuasion. The locations that these people were kept in were miserable, cold and damp. And there are cases of accused dying even before the trial. And while technically formal torture was actually illegal in English law, all of the above severe physical coercion we've talked about was widely used anyway to get confessions. And through that torture, Joane Williford was made to confess that rather than Thomas Gardner tripping over and accidentally falling backwards out of his window, what had really happened was that her familiars were small animals and creatures that witches supposedly had do their bidding on behalf of the devil and behalf of their desires for revenge and various other machinations. Joane Williford's familiar, a little dog who she named Bun, had carried him out of a window so that he fell into a backside. Which, let's face it, is just the most ridiculous thing to envision at all. This tiny dog, who knows what, let's picture a chihuahua, okay? I know there was pretty much no such thing as a modern day chihuahua back in 1645, but let's picture a chihuahua supernaturally lifting this grown adult man up and tossing him out of a window. But in 1645, it was taken so seriously that it obviously became part of the machinations of a capital case, that it was openly accepted as evidence and confession in a court of law. Williford's confession went on to say that the devil about 7 years ago did appear to her in the shape of a little dog, and bid her to forsake God and lean to him, and apparently sometimes brought her small sums of money. Sometime 1 shilling, sometimes 8 pence, never more at once. She called her devil by the name of Bun. The pamphlet also goes on to say that she'd apparently admitted desiring revenge on Thomas Letherland and Mary Woodruff, two completely unrelated people to this guy falling out of a window, and she'd also named the other unfortunate women as her fellows. And before you go, hey, that's a bit harsh, sounds like she just dropped these other 3 women right in it. But remember, she was very, very likely to have been quite seriously tortured.
This is what I love about old English towns is, this happened 400 or 500 years ago, and yet I can still stand here and be surrounded by buildings that I'm sure were here when this was going on. You look at this building here behind me, which, even though, the building next to it's not new, that was put there in 1911, but this building here right next to it is just kind of smack bang in the middle of all this industry that's happening alongside the creek. It's just this little old building here that's been there for hundreds of years and seen so much history. It's just incredible.
That old building is actually T.S. Hazard, which, as well as being the home of the Sea Cadets since about the mid-20th century, was originally the town warehouse and dates from about 1475, so didn't quite see this, but almost did. The statements of the next accused, Joan Cariden, followed a similar pattern. The pamphlet says that a black, rugged dog came to her at night, telling her to deny God and promised revenge on those that she bore ill will towards. It also indicates that she had cursed the mayor and some chap called John Mannington, and that because of this, she was subjected to the swimming test, which at the time had no actual legal standing throughout England, but was still used by smaller communities. And guess what? She floated.
I'm walking past the Shepherd Neame Brewery here in Faversham, and it did make me think, it's a shame that this wasn't here at the time, so they can only trace their origins back to about 1698, so about 50 years too late. Because I think if it had been here at the time, everybody just had a pint and gotten on with their lives. Maybe none of this would have happened.
Jane Hott's recorded confession is equally as revealing as the others. She was said to have described a familiar like a hedgehog, which was soft as a cat. A hedgehog as soft as a cat is definitely witchcraft. And that this soft hedgehog came to suckle from her. Apparently she too was given a good dunking and floated as well. Although apparently, according to her confession as well, the devil had promised her that she would sink and had deceived her. The devil went with her all the way and told her that she should sink. But when she was in the water, he sat upon a crossbeam and laughed at her. Again, unlikely that she actually said that, or at the very least said that without some coercion. Now, when the pamphlet comes to Elizabeth Harris, things take an even more tragic turn. The pamphlet says that she linked her bitterness and her drive towards the devil to the drowning of her son and to the loss of Goodman Woodcott's hoy, a small vessel. It claims that she wished God to be her revenger and believed that wish caused the vessel to be cast away. It also records her naming other women in town as people with very bad tongues, again reinforcing the stereotype of a witch being particularly quarrelsome. These trials were led by the mayor Robert Greenstreet, and possibly very tellingly, he was not necessarily a neutral investigator. Historians have noted that Greenstreet very often targeted critics, and Joan Cariden, who, remember, had allegedly cursed him years before during an earlier term as mayor, was one of those critics. It seems that Greenstreet may have had a very personal reason for removing her from the scene, and again lends that unfortunate pattern of witch trials and executions being used as a very convenient way to get rid of people without question. It's clear that, you take it at face value, this pamphlet very clearly wants the reader to believe that Faversham was probably crawling with witches. There were familiars everywhere, blood pacts going on, and secret meetings where the devil sat at the top of the table. And in Joan Cariden's examination, it even mentions a great meeting at Goodwife Pantry's house, with the devil at the upper end. But it's clear that ultimately what this actually reads as is 4 clearly innocent women who may have had local conflicts with people, or difficult tempers, or simply lived outside the town and were either shunned or just not trusted. Or, of course, there's also the option that they were just perfectly normal, had never done anything to hurt anyone, and just got caught up in the whole thing. But it shows how during this, the original witch hunt, how easy it was for people to suddenly find themselves accused of supernatural deeds and have no real defense, especially when in situations like this it was clear that part of the reason for these trials was political machination, which is exactly why stories like this still matter today, because it shows how easily tales that are just ordinary bad luck or ordinary daily suffering could be turned into evidence to ruin somebody's life.
What's interesting as you walk through the middle of Faversham here is, at once it's very different and also not that different. It's still the centre of the community, and it was here that our 4 unfortunate women met their very public end.
The title page of the 1645 pamphlet states plainly that Joane Williford, Joan Cariden and Jane Hott were executed at Faversham on Monday the 29th of September 1645. Modern local sources place the location of those executions in the marketplace near the Guildhall, and in 2024 a memorial stone was laid there to name and remember the 4 women and acknowledge the injustice that was done to them. Elizabeth Harris, unfortunately, seems to just vanish. The pamphlet, whilst saying that the other 3 women were executed, says that she was not yet executed. But that's all it says. Now, it's very likely that Elizabeth Harris was executed, maybe just a little later than the other 3 women. We have no evidence to say that she was or that she actually survived. She simply disappears from the record.
Something I love to do in places like this is, you just stop and picture what it would have been like 400 or 500 years ago, knowing that where you're standing was there, witnessing everything. You can see most of the buildings around here have the dates that they were built on them. There's one that was built in 1570 just over the road. Really is the closest thing we have to a time machine, is to be able to still stand in and occupy the same places that these people did. And as I walk under the Guildhall building here, just in front of me, is the memorial stone that was placed in 2024 to these 4 women. Now, supposedly, the spot that they were actually hanged from was very near the Guildhall, where I am right now, in the marketplace, from a tree. It's what tended to happen before proper gallows were built, is you had, the hanging tree, and that was apparently somewhere nearby. Now, obviously, that's gone, but I did manage to find the location of something else. Well, I've had to walk a little bit outside of town, but I promise you it's worth it. Maybe just for me, maybe none of you will care, but I now find myself on an old road called St Anne's Road, but that's not what it's always been called. Forget this. This used to be Hangman's Lane, suggesting that this road behind me here was the old route to the gallows. And in fact, this whole area, which is incredibly residential now, full of houses, none of this was here. This was known as Gallows Hole Field. And the gallows were just up there. Just behind me here is the former Faversham Arms. Obviously now it's just somebody's house, but apparently this is the site of the old gallows. It's always important to know, I think, if you're worried your house might be haunted, whether it used to be a gallows. Yeah, sure, this has nothing to do with this story. These women definitely weren't hanged here. This was a gallows that basically operated here from the 18th century, so nothing to do with this, but I think it's interesting. Now, it's very easy to look back at this whole period and think, people were running rampant, accusing neighbours here, there and everywhere. But actually it wasn't really like that. You think of that whole period, the 200 years that we think of now as, the witch hunting era, and of the 2,000 people in England who were put on trial accused of witchcraft, only around 100 were actually executed. Now, this obviously isn't to belittle the deaths of those around 100 men and women, but it wasn't as widespread and rampant as it's made out to be. It was awful, but there were still rational people, there were still rational judges, and the rule of law still functioned in most places, and it wasn't like people were running around like headless chickens going, she's a witch, immediately dead, she's a witch, immediately dead, he's a witch, immediately dead. It wasn't as straightforward as that. There were a lot, these are people, these are regular people like you and me, and, most people aren't idiots. Even during this whole period, it's easy to think of people as, simpletons who are driven solely by hearsay and suspicion and religion, and it wasn't like that. People knew that it was very easy to trick people. People knew that there were plenty of fraudsters out there trying to falsely accuse people that they didn't like to get people out of the way. People knew that people would simply accuse their neighbours of something like witchcraft because they didn't like them, or because they thought they were unattractive, or, any ridiculous little reason. So it's important to give people in England during this period more credit than they necessarily get. But, as we've seen here in Faversham and in places like Pennenden Heath, those 100 or so people who weren't so lucky, who did get executed, probably got executed because they were unfortunate enough to find themselves in a town where they were accused by the wrong person. And in Faversham we see that maybe that wrong person was somebody who had a significant amount of power and didn't want to lose it. Well, from the beautiful graveyard here at St Mary of Charity Church in Faversham, thank you for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, leave any suggestions for other stories like this that I can go and find in the UK, and I'll see you in the next one.